Welcome to Inside the Courtroom, the Chad Daybell trial. We're glad you're here with us, where we were going to piece together this week's testimony in this trial that surely has the attention of many in our community and really across the country and even across the world. Joining me is Morgan Romero. She has been covering this court case from the very beginning, and so she's here to let's talk about what we saw this week.
Yeah.
We started the week. I think, leading up to this point, we've heard from law enforcement. We've heard from, really setting the scene in terms of the facts, the evidence, the more technical details.
Right.
This week, we moved into some more emotional, personal stories, and we got to start to hear from family members.
Yeah, we did. And going off of that technical element, the cast FBI agent finished going over cellular data, geolocation history, as you discussed. It's been much of the case so far. It's also what we heard in Lori Vallow Daybell's trial. And then after him, we heard from Tammy Daybell's cousins, which I think is really important to point out that this is the first time that we're hearing from them, because in Lori's trial, she was charged with conspiracy to murder Tammy and convicted of it. Chad is charged with actually murdering Tammy. So we heard from her cousin Hannah, as well as her other cousin. I'm going to pull up her name right now. Bear with me. It is Patricia. And they talked about the day that Tammy died and what happened after Tammy died, and the stories that Chad Daybell told, and how rushed Tammy's funeral was. And so it was interesting. That was the first time we really got emotion too from people talking about Tammy and how loved she was and how amazing she was. I can go into a little bit of the funeral element right now. So as we've reported, Tammy died on a Saturday, and the story that Chad told law enforcement was that he woke up to her rolling off of the bed and tried to wake her up. She wouldn't wake up. He called his son Garth in. They called law enforcement, reported her. Law enforcement arrived. They confirmed that she was dead and ultimately ruled her death from natural causes due to a pulmonary edema. So that was the story originally. And what Tammy's cousins testified to was that just a few days later, after she died, they held her funeral and her memorial in Springville, Utah, which is where the Daybells lived before, where they were from prior to moving to Rexburg. And at those services, the cousins observed Chad telling different stories to different people.
Right. Yeah.
And that's the theme.
Yes, exactly. I was going to say, that's the theme of the week, I think, really, is we're going to hear some of these conflicting stories. And clearly getting a picture, prosecutors are trying to paint a picture of someone who was calculated, was not grieving, or didn't appear to the people in that room, when we heard from several of them who said it just didn't seem to match. Right. Not only does the information match, or not match up, or not add up, his response didn't seem normal. And I think it's important to note, we can't know how someone should grieve. There is no right or wrong way for someone to grieve, and we certainly see responses that you may not expect in people. And yet, in this case, it seemed to be the on again, off again, right? Yeah. And the word we kept hearing was scripted.
Yeah, scripted. That's what his sister-in-law said. And what we heard earlier in the week was, business-like, or he would cry when other people would cry. And so, his emotional reaction wasn't there, even in the, hours after Tammy had passed away. And some people testified this week that in hindsight, it looked like it, maybe they questioned, did he plan it? Right. One of his friends or his family members even asking, his friend asked his family member, do you think Chad did this as they were driving down Utah, taking Tammy's body down there? So, and at that everyone
point,
saw it.
I was going to say, and at that point, they didn't know about Lori. They don't know any of the other pieces of information that they would learn, and that we would, of course, learn in the days, weeks, and months after that. And I think, of course, that just adds to that speculation and that concern for them. But interesting that, without even any of the other information, they still had that thought of something isn't right.
And friends testified this week, and we'll get into this more, but about how their behavior in church kind of appeared different. They moved back to the back of the church service, and they appeared more distant from one another even. Right. And we later learned during that time Chad was having an affair with Lori Vallow. We heard from not only Tammy's family, we also heard from Chad's family, and the same thing that we just touched on, right?
Yeah.
The stories that he would tell, and yet at the same time, the defense trying to paint this picture of like, oh, Chad's meek, Chad is humble, Chad is quiet, he's not calling shots, he's not lying. You know, it's just it's been an interesting week for sure.
It has, and Chad's mother, his own mother, took the stand and answered questions about him and how she felt about what appeared to be certainly quick marriage to Lori after Tammy's passing. And you're right, the defense attorney is certainly trying to paint the picture that, just like they did in the very beginning, that he wasn't calling the shots. He was an introvert.
Right.
He was somebody who wasn't going to be the one that was making anything happen. He was more meek, more mild. And yet you also hear testimony about him really advocating and going to people and talking about the end of days.
Yes.
And kind of what I would call almost recruiting, recruiting folks to be part of that movement. And so certainly not those two explanations or those two descriptions of his behavior and his outlook don't seem to match.
Well, and even during Lori's trial, I mean, that was her trial, right? She's the one that was ultimately convicted in her own case. But even during her trial, it was pointing to Chad. And we talked about this the last time on Inside the Courtroom, of Chad was the one making the decisions about who was light and dark, who was evil and who was not, and who ultimately allegedly deserved to die, right, at their hands. And so we also heard from the chief medical examiner. He's now retired for the state of Utah. We heard from him in Lori's trial as well. He talked about why they decided to exhume her body and
Tammy's
ultimately, Tammy's body exactly in Utah. And we heard about that from law enforcement. So he's the next piece of that. And he discussed what's called a forensic autopsy and how that was done on Tammy's body. And as I mentioned, originally ruled natural causes, but they've had all these people testify about how she was really healthy.
Right.
She was active. One of her coworkers this week testified that she was in a workout class with her, saw her the day before she died. There was nothing wrong. Tammy was a librarian and was working and
realizing the only information about her being sick or having issues came from Chad himself.
Came from Chad. And the defense is using that to be like, oh, well, you didn't know about her anemia. You didn't know about her fainting spells, her coughing fits, which Chad said she had the night that she passed away. She was vomiting and coughing. And so that was Pryor, John Pryor, his defense attorney's line of questioning was, well, did you know about all this? And again, this was just in Chad's statements to police. Right. They never saw this in her records, but Chad also did say she didn't like to go to the doctor. And so that wasn't, that wouldn't be in her medical record. So anyway, this medical examiner goes over how they ultimately ruled that she had died by asphyxiation, specifically suffocation. They did this through something called a negative autopsy. So it's ruling out other things like intoxicants. And they were able to determine this is how she died. Now, same thing during Lori's trial. We may never know. Maybe in this case we will. Right. We may never know, though, how she was suffocated.
What cut off her air supply.
Yes. But you know what was interesting was you glean a lot from the prosecutor's redirect. So there's direct examination, then there's cross-examination, then there's redirect from prosecutors. And Lindsay Blake, one of the prosecutors, said, is it possible by the bruising on Tammy's body, because she had bruises all in her upper body, is it possible by looking at those bruises that somebody was restraining her while somebody else suffocated her? And they've never explicitly said
that two people were involved in that.
Because they don't have necessarily the proof of that, at least that we've seen so far. Potentially we will see that, but at least during Lori's trial, but that is the potential theory, right? So I think the most interesting people too that we heard from right after that medical examiner were the Gilberts. And I think that's to paint the picture too of these friends, these neighbors. We've talked about the theme of religion that that obviously plays a huge part in this, and really I think because Chad has used that evil and light or dark and light spirit type explanation to somewhat justify, I think, his approach to people and who was good and who shouldn't be here, and almost like he was protecting, protecting others from these dark spirits. Right. And yet people that practice now in the Church of Latter-day Saints say that's not what we believe. Right. And you start to hear them, from the Gilberts to even his sister-in-law, who we'll hear from in a little bit, talk about that they did not feel comfortable with what he was doing. They didn't feel comfortable with the message that he was sending. And I think that's what we heard from the Gilberts too, right? They became very, very disenchanted by what some of
Chad was trying to preach to others.
Yeah. And the whole group of people, and they became disenchanted when Chad didn't appear mournful after his wife died. And then he was very honest with the Gilberts, is what it seemed. Like he turned to them. They went to church together. Tammy and Alice Gilbert were on a women's religious organization together through the church. And he turned to them.
Yeah.
And he told them immediately after Tammy died, I can't live in that house. I'm moving out. I'm moving. Well, he wasn't honest about this. He said, I'm moving in with a friend to their apartment in Rexburg because I just can't be at the house. And then we later learned Lori had lived in Rexburg. Right. And then he said, you know what? And he told them, I found the woman I'm going to marry. A week after Tammy's funeral, I found the woman I'm going to marry. I met her in 2018 at a conference. Hey, she's in town. You want to meet her? And they met her, and they're like, what? And during that time that they met her, they asked her if she had any children. And going back to this theme of stories changing, they recalled her saying she had, or some people had said they recalled her saying she had 7 kids.
Right.
And then during their meeting with the Gilberts, Lori and Chad say that she had a daughter.
Right.
And Chad jumped in, actually. Chad
interrupted the conversation.
And goes, she had a daughter, but she died.
Yeah.
Which is then different than Lori telling other people that her daughter was at BYUI.
Exactly.
Right?
Right. And like we said, this will happen over and over again. If you start comparing the different stories, she tells multiple people, or he tells multiple people, that she had a daughter that passed away.
Right.
And that JJ, the younger one, was with her friend, which we now know, of course, we've heard from Melanie. She did cover for them for a while, or did mislead police about JJ's whereabouts, and yet we know that he was not with Melanie.
Right.
And so at no point have we ever been able to have anyone say, obviously, they did not see these children.
Right.
They didn't know where they were, but Lori and Chad actively telling different stories.
Right.
At the same time to different people.
And Lori never admitting she had a son, like a minor son.
Never talked about him.
That never came up. One thing I want to point out with the Gilberts' testimony was, and this was, I don't recall hearing this during Lori's, maybe it didn't come up, but Alice Gilbert said that when Lori was arrested, Chad came to them.
Yeah.
Because they were in Hawaii, right? They left Rexburg.
Right.
They got married, told the Gilberts. We're happy to show them pictures of their wedding, and then moved to Hawaii. And that's where Lori was arrested. And then after Lori was arrested in Hawaii, Chad came to them and said, hey, can you guys put your house up to bond Lori out of jail?
Yeah.
And they're like, no. Like, what is going on? And Alice had a really, it was an emotional soundbite where, she asks Chad, like, where is Tylee? Doesn't Tylee want to have a boyfriend, a job, a life? Where are these? At the time, she didn't actually, I don't think, know about JJ necessarily. This fight was just about Tylee. And one thing that Chad said, he said, she didn't like people and she didn't like me. And the prosecutor said, so he used the past tense. And she said, yes. Didn't. And but again, he wasn't coming forward and saying, he just kept telling people, like, verbatim, when this all comes out, you'll realize it'll be fine.
Well, and even Lori, if you remember, in her case, she said, no one, like, we're all going to know that what you think happened did not happen. Right. No one has been murdered. Right. And holding to that.
Or do they believe? I mean, this is the biggest thing. Or do they really believe that these children were possessed by evil spirits and now they're safe?
And that is something that we can probably continue to ask ourselves forever, of what do they know, what have they allowed themselves to believe versus what do they believe themselves and hoping that others believe differently. At what point does the delusion happen within themselves or just as they present it to others? Let's talk about, let's listen to this first soundbite. So I think let's get into some of these varying stories. So on the stand is Heather Daybell. So this is one of Chad's younger brothers, his wife.
Matt's wife.
Right. And they said they've known each other for 30, almost 35 years.
Wow.
They have been, a part of each other's lives because of this relationship. And she said it started out as what you would consider normal, average sister-in-law and brother-in-law relationship. Certainly got strained with time and as all this was happening. But let's listen in as she testifies to what Chad told her the day that his wife, Tammy, was found dead. So this is the same story that he initially told law enforcement and told everyone that we've heard from. Yeah. This was the story the day that it happened. So let's listen into that.
Other than just grief, was there anything else causing you to be upset?
Just not knowing what happened, having no information, and just she couldn't understand what would have happened.
So what did you do in reaction to that, being upset?
I called Chad myself.
When did you call him?
It would have been, I'm not sure, around maybe 9 or 10 in the morning. Matt had left for his conference. Chad picked up and I expressed my condolences and shock at hearing that Tammy had passed. And I just asked him what happened to her.
Would that have been 9 or 10 in the morning the same day?
Yes, on October 19th.
And can you please tell the jury how that call went? What did you first say and how did Chad respond?
So just expressing my sympathy and shock that Tammy had passed away, and asked him what had happened, if he could explain to me what had happened.
What did he say?
He said that Tammy had not been feeling well, that she, about 10 o'clock at night, started coughing pretty hard and then got to sleep. And then about midnight, she started coughing again hard enough that she vomited, got her settled down. And then he said at 6 in the morning, he'd slept from midnight to 6 in the morning, and woke up because the sheet that was on him had come off of him, and he heard a thud, and that woke him up. And he went to the other side of the bed and saw that Tammy had fallen off the bed, and he described her as she had died. She had been gone for a little while because she was hard. And so he called to Garth to come in and help him get Tammy back on the bed.
How did you react to that explanation of things?
But the whole time he was explaining that, it felt scripted to me, he was reading it or something. It just felt very scripted. It was the word that came to my mind, and it made me feel very uneasy.
Did you say anything to him about that scripted feeling or anything else?
I did not. I asked him if he was going to have an autopsy done to find out why she had passed, and he said no, that a coroner had come and looked at Tammy and could clearly see that there was matter in her throat, that's why she had died, as she had coughed hard and thrown up, and that had caused her death. So there was no need for an autopsy.
And that was Chad's explanation to you? Sorry.
Yes, it was.
What else did you talk about in that conversation?
He informed me that the funeral would be in 2 days. And I said, well, Matt and I aren't even home. We're in Las Vegas. Can you wait so we can get home? Matt had another brother that was out of town as well, and just said, can you wait till we can all get home to be to the funeral? And he said, no, we're just going to get it done.
Rush. Mm-hmm. What felt like we're not waiting, must get to the funeral certainly has come up a couple of times as well.
Yeah.
And she even Heather talked about being very familiar with what she would call normal or traditional funeral process and the way that would normally go. And then she goes into detail about how odd it felt at the funeral. Chad, like we talked about before, didn't seem to have the emotions that she expected, seemed to be laughing and joking with people one minute, crying when he thought he should almost, and kind of a very odd dynamic there. She talked about him being late to the luncheon after. She even talked about the music selection at the funeral. And she mentioned a song and how it felt so odd to her because it was a song about working, about, leaning your shoulder into the wheel. And she said none of it made sense.
Right.
Like she said it made her very, very uneasy.
Yeah. It just reminded me of a part where Alice was testifying about Chad's speech. So everybody was really proud of the children, of the Daybell children, how they spoke. But Alice pointed out that there were things that he said at the funeral, like telling everybody she had depression and wasn't easy to live with. And then like openly telling people that she would play video games and like kind of he thought she was like lazy. There was some interesting stuff that came up too about, and we've heard from like I said, coworkers and some friends who said it seemed like Chad was starting to kind of control what Tammy was doing. And like their friends would come over, or her family. We heard this from her cousin. Her cousin felt like she would come over and come up from Utah, and Chad would be like, okay, time to, like his body language would be like, kind of, okay, time to go.
Right.
You know,
almost like limiting
welcome.
access to her, and kind of controlling who was around her and what they were able to do with her, or how to interact with her.
And one thing I want to point out too is this has come up a few times, and we heard about this during Lori's trial, but Chad, because he believed he was this prophet that had visions, right? Which is very outside of the mainstream LDS faith, right?
Yes.
They have their people that they believe have these visions. And but Chad said, I had a vision that Tammy was going to die. He openly told people this, that Tammy was going to die before her 50th birthday.
Right.
And he'd be like, it is what it is, essentially.
It's going to happen. And almost like the end of days. Like,
correct.
This is going to happen. We need to prepare.
So she dies at 49.
Right.
She dies at 49. But he's like, that's what's meant to be. And he's telling people, I was meant to be married to her in this first chapter of my life. And now I'm meant to be married to Lori. And this is my next chapter. This is my next mission.
Right.
That's his justification.
Yeah, absolutely. And what people didn't know, even though they felt uneasy at Tammy's funeral, what they didn't know was that in the days before her death, we now know through a testimony about the computer forensics, looking at chat or the history on search engines and things like that, the Amazon shopping history that we know that Lori is shopping for wedding dresses, looking at rings, looking at bathing suits, presumably for their trip to Hawaii.
Exactly.
So it said feel uneasy, and then things start to happen that these family members now are starting to get more information, that things are making them even more uncomfortable. So we know that in this time period also that, again, still same different stories being shared, right? And now Lori's quickly coming into Chad's life publicly.
Yeah.
Sharing
has
that.
moved up to Rexburg from Arizona.
Exactly. Sharing that. Her brother is also now with her, Alex
and her niece,
Cox.
Melanie Boudreau.
So they're all together. And then Heather testified later that, a couple of minutes after sharing this story, she says, once I realized that he was now married to someone new, I asked him about it. I wanted to know what happened. So let's hear what she says. What did Chad say next?
Because I had learned that he had gotten remarried and that his children were struggling and upset. So I reached out in a group text to his children and let them know that I was there for them if they needed me, that they were upset. And that resulted in Chad calling me.
And please explain to the jury how the conversation went between you and Chad at that point.
I answered. He said, "This is Chad." And he was upset with me and told me I had been a problem for him his whole life. And I asked him, "Who is this person you've married?" And he explained her name was Lori. Would I like to meet her? And I said, no, I would not. And then I asked him what happened to Tammy. And he said she died of a pulmonary embolism because she had gained 40 pounds.
Now, earlier you've testified that you were seeing Tammy at least in church every week.
Yes.
Had you observed a 40-pound weight gain in Tammy?
I don't generally keep track of people's weight gain or loss, but I had not noticed a big increase in weight gain on Tammy, no.
How did you react to that when he gave that explanation?
I remember being so flustered by that explanation because he had given me a different one weeks before that I was just upset, and he indicated to me, I'm going to be living in Hawaii, so you don't have to worry about me anymore. And that was the end of the conversation.
Don't have to worry about me anymore. I'm moving to Hawaii. She also testified that Chad had accused her of being a problem, of being a problem in his life for a long time, for his entire life. She had been a problem. I think at one point called her a pot stirrer. And we talked about this in a previous episode, is that you tend to see that there's a little bit of a potentially some manipulation, or, you know, it's I'm going to tell you the story until I realize that you're not buying it.
Exactly.
And then now you're dark.
Now
you're
it's
a problem.
on you.
Right,
now it's
exactly.
on you. It's anytime. Yeah, exactly. Once you get in the way, and you know, same thing that she testified to. I mean, and then like you said, the prosecutor is telling a story, and all their witnesses so far have corroborated what she just said.
Right.
Tammy did not gain weight. Tammy was not unhealthy. Everybody was flustered and confused and shocked when she died.
It'll be interesting to see if any of the children are called, or any of the other people really close to her who he wouldn't be able to say didn't have access, because as you said, like, you know, he said she didn't like going to doctors. Nobody would have known this was happening. I feel like the children would have been close enough that they would not be able to say they didn't know how their mother was living or behaving. And it makes me wonder, like, about the coughing fits. Yeah. He says she has these. Is there anyone that the defense could call that's going to say, yes, I saw those, right? Or yes, I can say I did see some of these health issues. That will be interesting.
The defense did say that the kids saw some of this and told police about some of it. Not like to the extent that Chad has said it occurred, but like she wasn't herself.
Right.
She wasn't, she was tired. She was like kind of lethargic.
But, you know, interesting to see too is that he doesn't mention coughing. He doesn't mention at this point the, he changes the story completely because that doesn't hold up anymore. Right. Right.
I mean, you don't faint and die. You can call. Yeah. Right. And his story about, again, what he's told law enforcement has been the story throughout mostly was that he was in bed with her when she died, and then telling other people that we learned this week that, oh no, he was working. Right. She came down and said, hey, I'm not feeling good. Went back upstairs after throwing up, said, I felt better. I'm going to go back to bed. And then he goes up and finds her dead. Right. And then this medical examiner testifies like, hey, she was dead.
For a while.
Yeah. Like minutes to hours before he called.
And even calling his son to come help get her onto the bed. You have to, these jurors, right? These are people who, that's the point, is that they are this somewhat blank slate. They're going to listen to what's being said, but they have to make it make sense. And it's difficult to make it make sense, to think that you would find your spouse unresponsive, believe that they're dead, and not call immediately for help. Not call help as in your child come and help them get him back on the bed, but call for help from a medical professional, 911, law enforcement, paramedics. That's difficult, I think, for people to understand.
Yeah, and they're not able to say like exactly what time, it happened. But to find her body, stiff and cold, it's got to be a while. Yeah. We want to talk about today as well. Essentially, again, same thing we heard in Lori's trial about the way in which the children's bodies were found. But first, the Rexburg police detective who left the stand on yesterday during trial, he continued his testimony showing body camera video.
Yes.
So that's been really interesting. Yeah. Yesterday and today we saw body camera footage of law enforcement serving a welfare check and then a search warrant at Lori Vallow's townhome. And so Kay and Larry Woodcock, JJ's grandparents, had called police in Rexburg in November of 2019. At this time, Tammy was dead. The children were missing. Lori and Chad were married. Right. And called them and said, we need you to check. We don't know where JJ is. So they show up at Lori's apartment, and this body camera footage is so interesting. I mean, she's like chipper, and she's like, what are you doing here? Like, what are all these
What is
police?
this?
Yeah. You guys can watch it on our YouTube channel. And then she tells them that her brother is after her, and all these people are after her, trying to kill her. They were in cahoots with her ex-husband. Yeah. And
Kay Woodcock herself is trying to harm her and trying to take JJ away. She tells police JJ is with her friend. She goes into a story about Melanie's son also has autism, and JJ doesn't talk, and JJ doesn't like people, and almost how difficult he is. Right. But he's not here. He's with her.
Right. And then says, call, whatever. We know in the background from testimony so far that Chad called Melanie Gibb, that friend that Lori said she was with, and said, don't answer the phone when law enforcement call.
Right.
So Melanie doesn't answer originally. And so then police go, okay, we are going to go back and check. And so they go back to Lori's, and Lori says, oh, they must, they're at the movies. They're at Frozen 2. And that's when they ultimately were able to get a search warrant for the following day. So when they went back the following day, because they said something's not right here, and Melanie didn't initially answer, and she initially lied to law enforcement. We later learned JJ was never with Melanie, and she felt that, she says she needed to,
she had a change of heart and decided that
she needed to come forward and be honest. So Lori, her niece Melanie, and her brother Alex are gone when police go the next day. So we saw body camera footage of that today, of them searching all of their townhomes in Rexburg. Right. The closet was cleared in Lori's. She'd taken all of her things, and Melanie Boudreau had a binder full of her ex-husband Brandon Boudreau, who Alex Cox is accused of trying to kill. It's very complicated. Anyway, she has a binder full of his credit cards and his IDs, and police go, okay, something's fishy. So he finished his testimony talking about the search warrants on the geolocation history. There was also this question of if somebody's geolocation services are turned off,
can we still get that information?
It's in no, it's not possible. That's why Alex Cox throughout this whole thing has been the only one that they've been able to pinpoint physically through those services, because he had his Gmail account attached. Yeah. So they wrap up his testimony with Detective Stubbs, and they bring in an FBI special agent who is on this team called ERT, Evidence Recovery Team, and he is the one who led the team that found the remains of JJ and Tylee. And so the day ended today a little bit earlier than normal, with him on the stand, and jurors saw pictures of Tylee's burned remains. Yeah. All that was left of her was bone and charred flesh and melted flesh in a green bucket. Yeah. But they ultimately later determined that it was Tylee. And then that was after they found JJ. I expect on Monday we're going to learn more about that. Him, But again, that's also information that we learned during Lori's trial.
Found on Chad Daybell's
property. Yeah, and they had all this evidence, a few things pinpointing them. They talked about areas of interest, like priority areas, and why the FBI was told to go to certain places. So that included the fire pit, the pet cemetery, and that's because Chad had sent a text message
about burying a raccoon
Tammy about
or something
shooting a raccoon and then needing to burn limbs in the fire pit. So they knew about the pet cemetery, they knew about the fire pit, and then there was a tree on the property, which is ultimately where they found JJ's body wrapped in a plastic bag and buried. So talking about how difficult it is to excavate an area like this, to be very, very fragile.
And very cautious about wanting to not destroy or disturb evidence.
Exactly.
And then also just the emotional toll, the magnitude of this search for those folks who were part of it. I certainly can't help but think about what they were experiencing, finding young children. And
Detective Stubbs, the Rexburg police detective, is talking to jurors today, getting emotional, crying, wiping his eyes. I mean, to see these law enforcement agents who have been so heavily involved in this, what they thought at the time was a search for missing children, and then to later learn that the kids were killed and then buried in such brutal ways, inhumane ways. A lot of them have gotten emotional.
Yeah. And all while we now know that this is at the same time that Tammy is laughing. Lori is laughing and somewhat jovial with police and talking about Chad. Who's Chad? Oh no, Chad's just a friend of my brother's.
Yeah.
While she was actually married to him.
And after the kids, police believe, were killed.
Right. And the kids are now buried on this property, already killed. Tammy's there, and he's talking about, Chad is talking to Tammy about having to bury a raccoon while Tammy's still alive. So that's where this, really starts to get very dark. Yes. I want to talk about something that's dark.
Very dark.
That's certainly dark. And again, where everybody's trying to piece together a lot of circumstantial information, but prosecutors setting a pretty strong case for a lot of information coming directly from Chad.
Right.
That did not match what they knew was happening, but also didn't even match the other stories that he's telling other people.
Right.
And I think that this week has been the most telling thing we've heard.
Yeah, I think so too. And, it's tough when they asked jurors during this jury selection, just as they did last year, can you convict somebody without knowing how they died? That's very well likely going to be the case still with JJ and Tylee all these years later. We don't know about Tammy. But jurors may never know how these kids were killed. They just know that they were killed and they were found buried on Chad Daybell's property. And a necklace was presented today that belonged to Tylee and found in the fire pit. And law enforcement came in and presented physical evidence today of shovels and a pick that they found in Chad's garage. And so they'll talk more about that and how they did testing on those things, trying to tie it, back to him. But again, it goes back to what we've said. And it must be very, very difficult for jurors. I've actually been sitting next to a juror that served in Lori's trial. We've interviewed him. He's amazing in terms of just his recollection, and he's writing another book on this. And he told me, he's like, when all of this was coming out during Lori's trial, and we're sitting there in the jury, it is so hard to piece together. I mean, following a story with so many people and moving parts, it's just so complex. And so you see these jurors taking notes. They're paying attention very intently. And it remains to be seen, what the outcome will be of Chad's.
And we have shown you, I mean, we have a family tree, somewhat, if you want to look at it that way, all of the connections, because you're right, it is complicated, it's convoluted. We do have a lot of this on our website at ktvb.com. You can certainly look there. If you have questions for us, you can text those to us. We will be happy to try to get the answers for you if any of the pieces or parts are not coming together clearly, and we can answer any of that. We certainly are wanting to do that here on Inside the Courtroom as we continue to follow this and figure out, what else the prosecution is going to be able to present. We still have weeks left.
So we're in, technically, this is week 5, including jury selection. Week 4, just including, arguments and evidence. But we expect this to go for a total of 10 weeks, including the death penalty phase if he's convicted. So we're about halfway there.
And we know that Lori was convicted on that circumstantial evidence. So certainly it's a possibility that could happen again, but we are going to continue to follow it. We'll watch it each day. We'll share that with you, and we hope that you'll be back here for our next Inside the Courtroom.